Hi everyone, my name is Devin. I'm a librarian at the Worcester Public Library, and today I have with me Corin Hirsch. Hi Corin.
Hi there.
It's so nice to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Corin is an award-winning food and drinks writer who has authored the book Forgotten Drinks of Colonial New England. Let me get that a little closer. From flips and rattle skulls to switchel and spruce beer. In the book, she explores the origin and tastes of the favorite potations of early Americans and offers some modern day recipes to revive them today. She's also worked as a food critic in New England, and she's now on Long Island, where she's part of the busy team at Newsday. So I'm curious, Corinne, when did you first become interested in the culinary world?
Well, I grew up in a house where we talked about food pretty much constantly. When I was a teenager, my stepmother cooked all the time, and when she was cooking one meal, we'd be talking about the next. So I think I probably got interested in food before I even knew I was. It was just part of daily life. And in terms of food writing, I started that in earnest maybe about 11 years ago when I was living in New England. And I'd like to dine out before that. I just never put two and two together that it was something that I would make a career out of until an editor asked me to write a food column. And then within a few weeks, it was clear that it was something I really enjoyed.
Well, that's exciting. It's a little bit like destiny. So I was looking through your book and I really enjoy it. One of the things I was surprised by and impressed is you put a lot of historical information in there as well as imagery, which I thought, as someone who doesn't really like history, spiced it up for me. I like the images you have in there as well. I was wondering what you enjoyed most about writing this book.
Well, certainly finding some of those historic plates and prints was exciting. When you're going through an archive and you come across something that pertains to what you're researching and is something unexpected that you didn't know, there's definitely a thrill, an electric thrill to it. So that was my favorite part, was uncovering things I was unfamiliar with in terms of the history of drinking in colonial America. It was so prevalent, and I would just find surprise after surprise in terms of certain characters, historic characters who drank more than you thought they did, or Harvard having a brewery when it was first founded, just facts like that, and having them come up pretty constantly through research was my favorite part. And I think any journalist would say that about a project, is just coming across the unexpected is really what makes it worthwhile.
And did you go through archives or do library research?
It was both archives, so primary research, and a fair amount of secondary research too. There are some things lost to time, but were recorded in other books that people wrote at the time. So some of that, and then going through, there's a record of the Vermont legislature from, I think, 1787. I might have the year, I think I have the year right, but it's in some archives in Montpelier in Vermont, and you can see what those statesmen were drinking every day. So they recorded it every single day, and it's still in the handwriting of the time. So records like that, and town records. I went through quite a lot of town records for various towns in Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Hampshire. They might record how much cider a particular community put away for the winter, for instance. So that was exciting.
That does sound fun. So I was wondering, I guess this sort of dovetails into what you were just saying. Was it difficult to find the traditional historical recipes that you included in your book?
It was somewhat challenging. As I mentioned, I found a lot of them through secondary sources. So I didn't come across too many handwritten recipes, although did meet some New Englanders who had family in the area for generations who would have family recipes for something like switchel, which is a vinegar, a sweet and sour drink, non-alcoholic, handed down through their families. So there occasionally I'd come across things such as that. But it was challenging trying to cobble together all these different pieces in a fairly short amount of time. I think I did the research and wrote the book in just a space of a few months. You can see it's a fairly slim book, but it was still fairly fevered, the process that went into it.
Even though it has a lot of information in it.
Yeah.
So I was also really impressed with the modern day recipes that you include. And I just, as a foodie and like a cookbook person, I was really impressed with the photos. Did you speak to a mixologist in doing the modern updates on the old drinks?
I didn't. And to be honest, I'm a lot better at mixing drinks now than I was then. I mean, some of those are they're very straightforward, and I tested them. There might be changes. I guess it's about 4 years now. No, it's 6 years now that I've been sort of perfecting my technique. And I was a bartender at one point in England, where in Britain, where the drinks are fairly straightforward. They weren't that complicated, at least in the pubs that I worked in. So I have some experience in that regard. But I did not consult with anyone else. I sort of forged ahead on my own, and for better or for worse. I do think the historic recipes are more interesting, but a few of particularly my modern one for Stone Fence, which is cider with rum, and I think I put a twist in it, or kind of an extra element. That recipe is kind of fail-proof. So it's easy to improve on.
Well, it's really impressive you did all that on your own. So because you're a food writer, I imagine you've eaten a lot of different things, and I wonder what the most unusual was.
I think the most unusual, probably not to the area I was in either instance, was in Sydney. I had lamb brains, like fried lamb brains, which pretty much soon after landing, I had massive jet lag and was taken to lunch. So I just sort of dug in, and they were, the consistency is sort of puts you off a little bit, but the taste is pretty good. And then in South Korea, some jellyfish salad. It's a cold salad made from jellyfish tentacles. I think you can find it here in Korean communities. So I had never encountered it before, so that was pretty unusual for me at the time.
What was the consistency of the lamb brains, if I can ask? Was it chewy?
Really spongy and soft.
All right. Okay, so how has your work changed because of the virus?
Well, we were locked down. I'm in New York, so we were pretty early on in the lockdown. Not a total lockdown. We, of course, could still go out to the store, but it was pretty empty out on the street and pretty quickly. So my work changed immediately. I was working from home and reporting stories over the phone, whereas normally I would go out quite a bit. And then shifted dramatically, and still is to an extent, from sitting in a restaurant to takeout. And following as restaurants have really upped their takeout game, restaurants that weren't really doing much takeout before, I put a lot of thought into that. So that's been a new development this year. And of course, masking and just being distant from subject, and always assessing how much risk you're willing to take in terms of reporting a story was a new element to my job. And I think all of us, at least on my team, have different levels of comfort in terms of going into restaurants or not. So it's an ongoing, it just keeps unfolding every day. We've just taken a few steps back here this week. So we'll see how it keeps changing.
Makes sense. I also saw online that you've been writing about haunted kitchens and bars, which I didn't know was a thing. So I wanted to ask, is it common for older establishments to have a ghost story connected to them?
It's fairly common. I have varying theories about why it's common. I think establishments that are open to the public over long periods of time tend to develop stories. I think in a few instances, the people I've spoken with make a convincing case for their places being haunted. In New England, there's a lot of old structures, and so there's a lot of history that has occurred in those buildings, and people who work there have or even stay in some of these inns, have stories that sound pretty believable. And I've worked at a few publications there in New England until I came back down to Long Island where I grew up to work for Newsday. And I'd say every region has, you can find this. I've done a form of this story at a number of different publications. And my interest in it goes back to when I worked in the UK. I worked in a pub that had been built in the late 1400s, I believe. And from the first night I was working there, all of the locals told me stories, and I thought perhaps they were just trying to scare me or make me nervous because I was sleeping upstairs in a room there. But I became very interested in that aspect of old businesses and old restaurants and things.
Wow, I really like reading paranormal things, and I'm gonna have to go out looking for a haunted restaurant.
You should. It's a fun exercise, and if you're in a place that's more than a few decades old, just ask someone who works there. Have you ever seen or heard anything? Almost always you'll get a story.
Right, I will try that for sure. On social media, I saw that you call yourself an endurance eater. So on a busy day, probably when we're not under virus restrictions, how many types of cuisine do you think you've eaten in one day?
I've probably hit about 6 or 7 in one day. I mean, that's the most, which doesn't sound like a lot. Just speaking of it, it's a lot to stuff into one eating session. And I used to call it app surfing because my strategy would be to just have a small plate at each place I went to, or just a few kind of emblematic appetizers of the spot, and do that over and over again. I do review restaurants as well, though not at the moment because of COVID. We've suspended those, but that would be an entirely different process of just focusing on a place. But when I am reporting a trend or about a town or something like that, I'll eat at a bunch of places at once.
I think 6 is impressive.
Yeah.
Well, if you've enjoyed this conversation with Corin as much as I have, make sure that you sign up for her upcoming author talk, which is on Saturday, November 21st at 11 a.m. She's going to do a virtual talk and tasting of colonial era beverages, both spiked and non-alcoholic. She'll explore the roots and reasons behind early Americans' enthusiasm for drink, and break down the building blocks of a rudimentary colonial era bar, as well as touch on key events where alcohol played a role. And segueing from the 1700s, she'll also discuss her adventures as a food critic. So we hope to see you there, Corin and I. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Devin.